We are in the list of negative commandments. Out of the 613 commandments, this is negative commandment 72. And we were talking about this yesterday, and that was that Levites cannot do the job of Kohanim. Levim cannot do the job of Kohanim, priests, and priests can't do the job of Levim. And we even said that within the Levites, they had different responsibilities. But they couldn't switch between those different responsibilities. And the way when we were looking at the Rambam and his codes, he had mentioned, I don't know, do we finish all of it? I just want to look here. He had mentioned that within the tribe of Levi, there are two primary responsibilities: guarding the gates, so they're like the beef eaters, they're the honor guard of the Beit HaMikdash, and singing. When it comes to playing musical instruments, then even Israelites were allowed to play as part of the orchestra. But as far as singing goes, that could only be Levites, and it could only be that group that were designated as the singers. Okay, yeah, so let's and then we were talking about the actual flute. So there was a time when the flute was dominant, and he listed those different times. There were also harps and trumpets and lyres and a cymbal. We talked a little bit about the music and about the singing, and that we don't have a tradition about what that actually sounded like. Although there are like the Gregorian monks claim to have a tradition about what it sounded like. All right, a Levite may not enter the temple courtyard to perform his service until he studied for 5 years beforehand. The concept is derived as follows. This is the edict with regard to the Levites from the age of 25 until 30. How can this contradiction be resolved? They study for 5 years and do not enter service until they fully mature and attain manhood, each man to his service. The Torah states at the age of 50, he'll turn back from the ranks of the workers of the sanctuary. So there's really only 20 years between the age of 30 and 50 when they were doing their specific work. That applied only area when the sanctuary was carried from place to place. It is not an ongoing mitzvah for future generations. For future generations, a Levite is not disqualified because of age or because of physical blemishes, only due to a change in his voice. If his voice spoils because of advanced age, then he's disqualified from serving the temple. It appears to me that he is disqualified only from serving as a singer, but he could become one of the doorkeepers. Now, how can he become a doorkeeper if the Rambam had said you can't switch back and forth? Just had that. Didn't he say that? Now he's saying they can switch back and forth. All right, we'll go back to that. Samuel, the prophet, and King David divided the Levites into 24 watches. Each week, a different watch would serve in the temple. The head of the watch would divide all the men of the watch into different clans. On each day of the week, designated men would serve. The heads of the clans would assign the workers on the day that they were designed to work, allotting each one appropriate tasks. All the Levites are warned not to participate in the service of the altar, as it states, but to the holy utensils and to the altar they should not draw close, so they do not die. This prohibition implies that they should not draw close to the service of the sanctuary, but they may touch the sacred vessels. He mentioned that before, that you can't use them in service, but that doesn't mean you can't touch them. Just as the Levites were warned not to perform the service of the priests, so too the priests are warned not to perform the work of the Levites, as the above verse states. Also, you shall not die. Similarly, the Levites themselves, here we go. Similarly, the Levites themselves were warned that each one should not perform the task incumbent on a colleague. Thus, a singer should not assist a doorkeeper, nor a doorkeeper a singer. Every man according to his service and his burden. So this is the statement that we had read in the code, in the book of Mitzvahs, and now he's saying it again. So if I was going to put these together, I would say that what it must mean now is not that they can never do the other person's work. In other words, if they're not a singer, they could be a doorkeeper. If they're not a doorkeeper, and what this means is like a guard. If they're acting as a doorkeeper, they can't be a singer. If they're acting as a singer, they can't be a doorkeeper. But if they retire from one, they could do the other. That's what it has to mean. Let's see here. Sefer Mitzvot, negative mitzvah 72, that's us. And Sefer Chinuch, mitzvah 389, include the prohibition against performing service designated for someone else in the reckoning of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. The Kesef Mishnah questions the Rambam's ruling because according to Arachin 11b, the source of the Rambam's ruling, it would appear that someone who merely renders assistance is not liable for violating a scriptural commandment. Every man according to his service and his burden. But that's, I guess, how we're going to have to explain it. During your time as designation as a vocalist, you can't do the work of honoring, of guarding the doors or the gates. But it must be only during that time of where you're actually designated for that service. Because he had previously said that if they can no longer sing, then they could become gatekeepers. I had understood it originally to mean that if you were a family of gatekeepers, you had to be gatekeepers, and if you're a family of vocalists, you have to be a vocalist. But that is not what it appears to mean. It just appears to mean that if you're assigned to a designated role, then you can't do the other one. The Rambam says you can't even help. So if you're a vocalist, you can't even help guard the doors. But as they mentioned, the Kesef Mishnah is one of the commentaries on the Rambam's codes, and it was actually written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who is the author of the Shulchan Aruch. So he is, and they leave this as a question, he is questioning where the Rambam gets that from. Remember, I mentioned yesterday that there are commentaries who sort of fill in the Rambam sources, because Maimonides' claim is that he is simply distilling the oral law, which means that you should be able to find the source for any of the laws in the codes, in Maimonides' codes. You should be able to find that source somewhere in the Talmud or in Midrash, somewhere in the record of the oral law. And so there are commentary. The Rambam it is not here to reproduce the oral law. He's here to distill it. So he'll give a legal ruling, and then you'll have these commentaries who fill in the sources for the Rambam. And one of those is the Kesef Mishnah. Well, it's one of the things Rabbi Yosef Karo does. But here he's having trouble finding the source for his statement that they can't help, especially because he is suggesting that the Talmud says you are allowed to. So that gets left as a question. Okay, yeah, all right. When Levites perform the service of a priest or one Levi assistant in a task that is not his, they are liable for death at the hand of heaven. In other words, this is not something that would be brought to a court, but there is what is identified as a heavenly death penalty. So if Levites perform the Kohen service, it would appear it's the same punishment if an Israelite performs a Kohen service. There is a heavenly death penalty. But if, when by contrast a priest performs the service of a Levite, he's not liable for death. Instead, he violates merely a negative commandment. So it's still a violation, and there would be a punishment of lashes if he did it, but it is not a death penalty. And this, again, brings up that subject that we brought up before, which is once the priests are designated, once Aaron is singled out as the beginning of the priesthood, and his children are then going to become the priests, they are singled out for singular service, but they still represent a subset of the tribe of Levi. So it's not a mistake to say that Kohanim are also Levites. They originate from the tribe of Levim. But when it comes to the work that is done in the Beit HaMikdash, they seem to be completely distinguished. In other words, they don't retain characteristics of Levites. They are not, and this would be one of the places where you see that, because if a Kohen acts as a Levi, that is a prohibited to him. He's not allowed to do that. He's not allowed to act like a Levi, even though he could show by lineage that he comes from the tribe of Levi. Once the Kohanim have been distinguished, they are considered a separate entity. The priests were set aside from the Levites as a whole to perform the sacrificial service, as it states in 1 Chronicles 23:13, and Aaron was set aside to sanctify him as the Holy of Holies. It is a positive commandment to distinguish the priests, make them holy, and prepare them for the sacrifices, as Leviticus 21:8 states, and you shall sanctify him because he offers the food of your God. It is necessary for every Jewish person to show them much honor and to give them priority for every matter of holiness, for instance, to begin reading the Torah first, to recite blessings first, and to take a desirable portion first. So this is a mitzvah that still applies to this day, and that's why you see in congregations that when it comes to the first, the way, so let's say on Shabbos, there are really 8 people called to the Torah. The Torah portion is divided into 7 portions, and then there is something we call maftir, which is an additional reading that was added, and then coupled with a reading from the prophets called the Haftorah. So the order of the reading is, first you call up a Kohen, and that's because of this mitzvah. That everybody has to treat them with honor, with great honor, and that they should be first in everything, which is a matter of holiness. So the Kohen is called up first, and then the Levites are called up second. So representative from Levi is called up second. So he does not mention that when he's talking about the Levites yet. Maybe he's going to mention it, that they also are given honor because they're always called second. And then after that, you call what are called the Israelites, anybody who's not a Kohen or a Levi. But that's not the only thing. You're always supposed to give them these kinds of honor whenever there's a matter of holiness. So anytime somebody is being, where a representative of the people is brought forward to do some kind of honor. So for instance, in the Birkat HaMazon, when it comes to reciting the grace after meals, when you have 3 or more men present, there's a kind of introduction to the Birkat HaMazon, and you are meant to, if a Kohen's there, you're meant to ask them, would you like to lead us? They could say no. When it comes to the laning, when it comes to Torah reading, for some reason they cannot turn it down. I don't know what the distinction is between them. When it comes to Birkat HaMazon, when you ask them to lead, they can turn it down, and then you could just have somebody else lead. But
Rabbi,
they can't say, I'd rather have a Yisrael do the first Aliyah. I don't know why.
What I'm thinking of is that there might be a lot of guys who are Kohens who don't know how to read and lane, and they don't have to. If they're called to the Torah, they can just, read that transliterated thing and someone reads for them. In the Birkat HaMazon, they're asked to actually say something they don't know how to do.
Well, they could have a transliterated thing for Birkat.
Well, that's true, but
Can I ask a stupid question?
Why would
ask a stupid question, David? Go ahead.
I'm just trying to get straight at this. With the Levim, according to the Rambam, he's saying that their period of service is only for 2025 to 50. Now, after 50, what they're done, they can go, they can, start manufacturing ceramics or whatever. They can do what they want.
But he said that was only during the desert time.
Oh.
He said that after not once you're not in the desert, and that, I guess because there it involved actually schlepping the Mishkan, the different things of the Mishkan. That was a part of their duties. But then he made the point that after the desert period, they don't have to retire at 50.
Okay, what about a Kohen? If you're a Kohen, are you a jet for life?
Right, so the Kohanim, that's a good question. I don't know what the answer to that question is. I mean, I know there's a particular Kohen Gadol who remained Kohen Gadol into till at least 70. Yeah, he hasn't mentioned it about Kohanim yet. Let's see if he mentions it about the Kohanim. If he doesn't, that's a good point of distinction. It sounds like, again, that you don't have to, it didn't sound like with the Levim, he has to stay on after 50. It sounded like he could stay on after 50. Let's just go back there for a second.
As long as a Kohen can duchen, he's obligated to duchen. We talked about that a long time ago.
Right. I agree with you. I don't think there's an age limit, but we didn't see him talk about it. But even here he said, at the age of 50, he will not turn back from the ranks of the workers of the sanctuary, applied only in the area. Sorry, at the age of 50, he will turn back from the ranks of the workers of the sanctuary. That applied only in the area where the sanctuary was carried from place to place. It is not an ongoing mitzvah for future generations. For future generations, a Levite is not disqualified because of age or because of physical blemishes, only due to a change in voice. It doesn't say it. Yeah, so I thought he had used language that, here, let's just see here, because this was written in Hebrew, not Arabic. Ein alevi nifsal b'shanim v'lo b'mumin ela b'kol. Yeah, so if they use the language of disqualified, posel, so it sounds like it didn't sound like it's really up to him. He just keeps on doing it as long as he can do it. Yeah, I thought it had a language that made it sound like it's up to him, but it doesn't really sound like that. Okay, so that was the Levim. Let's see if there's more about the Kohanim. Let's see what happens here. Moshe divided the priests into 8 watches, 4 from Elazar and 4 from Itamar. This continued until the days of Shmuel the prophet. We saw that Shmuel himself seemed to be a Levi. At that time, he and King David divided them into 24 watches. Each watch, there was one who served as a leader. A watch would ascend to Jerusalem to serve for the entire week. They would switch on the Sabbath day. The previous watch would depart, and the one which follows would enter. This cycle would continue until its completion, and then they would start again. So what he means is, there's thousands of Kohanim. So on a particular day, there's not work for thousands of Kohanim on a particular day in the Beit HaMikdash. So you had people, let's say 100 or so, that would come for 1 week at a time. And these are actually family members. So you'd have your cousins and your uncles, brothers and fathers, etc. They would all have a week of the year that they would be working in the Beit HaMikdash. From other places, we know that there were certain jobs that were skilled jobs that really took a long time to learn. Those were done permanently. In other words, there were certain people that were always working in the Beit HaMikdash, but a lot of the jobs were filled by members of these, they called them a mishmar. So you'd be like a week-long warrior, like that term, weekend warrior. So you'd be like a long warrior. So you'd show up at the Beit HaMikdash that week, and your family would sort of spread out and do all the jobs that were available for people to do. So there are 24 of those watches. So you'd have a schedule with where there would be you're on one week, the next family's on the next week, the next family's on the next week. And then the cycle would begin anew. So you'd have 2 weeks out of the year where your family is called up to do this kind of thing. Also, there were holidays like Passover or Sukkot where there was a lot to be done, and it could be a lot more of them are called up for those days, just because there's so much work to be done, especially at the beginning of Passover, but even on Sukkot, because you have the pilgrimage festival, you just imagine that there was a lot more work for them to be done. So it could be that 48 weeks of the year are being done by these families 1 week at a time, and then some of the holiday weeks would be done by more of those families together, maybe sometimes all of them together, as it says. It is a positive commandment for all the watches to share equal status during the pilgrimage festival days. As one of the priests who comes during the pilgrimage festivals and desires to serve in the temple may serve and receive a portion of the sacrifices. One of the benefits of being on the watch that week is that when there are offerings, there's a portion of a lot of the offerings that is left for the priests that are working there, for the Kohanim that are working there. So if you have lots of offerings being brought, then you're going to have lots of Kohanim to receive that. A lot of times it's meat. Sometimes it could be skins and other things, but a lot of times it's meat. And so even just to eat all that meat, you need to have a lot of people there. Any one of the priests who comes during the pilgrim festival is desired to serve in the temple may serve and receive a portion. We do not tell him, go and wait until your watch receives in turn. Deuteronomy 18:6 says, when the Levite will come from one of your cities to the place that God would choose, he shall serve. In which context does the above apply? With regard to the sacrifices of the festivals, the division of the showbread and the 2 loaves offered on Shavuot, vowed offerings, free will offerings, and the daily offerings are offered only by the watch that serves at the time. This applies even during the pilgrimage festivals. As it states in chapter 8, or verse 8, a portion of portions shall they eat, except for what was transcended by the ancestors. The implication is that they will partake portion for portion of the communal offerings, but not the other sacrifices, for those were already divided by the ancestors and established to each watch in a week. Similarly, the service involved with the showbreads is performed by the watch whose turn is established. The service involved the 2 breads of Shavuos. The service involved with the 2 breads of Shavuot is performed by all the watches. How do we know? How do we know that it is speaking about priests? All right, and then it talks about other things to do with the korbanos, about the offerings. The head of every watch divides his watch into clans so that the priest in each clan will serve on one of the days of the week. One on one day, another on the next, and another on the next. Each of the clans had a head who was appointed over it. So he is suggesting that these Kohanim they didn't all work for 7 days. They had their day. So let's say there's a clan that has, a family that's going up that has, let's say, 200 people working. They would be divided into 30 each day, and they would work that day. Again, the Rambam is talking about this, whether or not this is always how it worked. Once, let's say they're saying from the beginning of the first temple, this is the way it worked. Did it work that way always? It sounds like these sound more subjective and open to change if it should need be. But this, I guess, is the way it typically worked. Maybe it's the way it always worked, but it doesn't sound, these sound more subjective. A high priest is appointed to serve as the head of all the priests. Now, it doesn't say how in the Rambam here. Let's see. He is appointed by the High Court of 71 judges, as stated in Halacha 15, to serve as the head of all the priests. He is anointed with the anointing oil and clothed in the garments of the high priests, as Leviticus 21:10 states. So the Sanhedrin appoints the high priest. The priest who is elevated over his brethren, over whose head was poured the anointing oil, if there's no anointing oil, is anointed into office by wearing the garments of the high priest, as the above verse states, over those whose head was poured the anointing oil and who was initiated to wear the garments. Implied is that just as he's initiated with the anointing oil, so too he's initiated with the garments of the priesthood. So then they talk about that. Yes, so he is appointed by the Sanhedrin. As it says here, a high priest should be appointed only by the court of 71 judges. He should be anointed only during the day. In other words, it shouldn't happen at night on the day of his anointment. Similar, if he was initiated merely by wearing the priestly garments, the initiation should only take place during the day. The two high priests should not be initiated together. We also appoint a priest who will serve the high priest like a viceroy. He's called the Sagan, and he is also called the appointed one. He should stand at the right hand of the high priest at all times. This honor is given to him. All other priests are under his authority. In addition, catecholim are appointed to serve the Sagan, a Greek term meaning general officer, are appointed to serve the Sagan as the Sagan serves the high priest. There should be no less than two of them. And then there's somebody called Amir Kalin. This is Aramaic words. Should be appointed. Oh, they say the word Amir might be related to this. Radbaz suggests that an emir, which is a leadership position in Arabic, the keys to the temple courtyard are in their hands. If one desires to open the courtyard, he cannot until all the Amir Kalin gather and open it. Then there's treasurers appointed under the Amir Kalin. There should be no less than three. They collect the consecrated articles, redeem those which should be redeemed, and use the proceeds for purposes that require these expenses. A high priest who is anointed receives precedence over one who is installed by wearing the garments. One installed by wearing the garments who is prepared to serve receives precedence over an anointed high priest who was disqualified because of a seminal mission. This means that they were temporarily disqualified, and so somebody else has to take their place. One disqualified because of a seminal mission receives precedence over one disqualified because of a physical blemish. So what happens if a high priest was high priest and then suddenly develops one of those blemishes which render one incapable of serving? So he still gets honor, but now it's like less, in the scale. Priest anointed to lead the nation in war receives precedence over the Sagan. So he did not talk about this priest, but this is also a kind of high priest who, as the title says, leads the people in times of war. So he's like the spiritual inspiration to the soldiers when they are fighting. And then, and all these people have precedence over the Sagan. So these are all versions of high priests. The Sagan receives precedence over a catechol over a miracle, and a miracle over a treasurer over a head of watch over a head of clan, and a head of clan over ordinary priest. Thus, there are 8 rungs in the priesthood, one above the other. When the king, the high priest, or any other official dies, his son or anyone fit to inherit him is appointed in his stead. So this, even though it's the official people to appoint them are the Sanhedrin, that doesn't necessarily mean that they just pick anyone they want. There is precedence to a son. If a son of the high priest is considered fitting, they are supposed to appoint a son. If there's somebody else who just appears to be very suitable for the position, they're supposed to appoint him. Those who are higher in the order of inheritance receive precedence with regard to receiving the position of the deceased, provided he is equivalent of the deceased in wisdom or in the fear of God, even if he is not comparable, or in the fear of God, even if he's not comparable in wisdom. So there are 2 things you're looking at. You're looking at, is he wise? But you're also looking at, does he fear God? So if he has 5 sons, so the first son would be the one you look at first. And if he is comparable in wisdom or in fear of God, then that's the one the Sanhedrin should choose. And then you go down the list in order of age. And this is true with the king as well. He and his descendants in the midst of Israel. This teaches that the kingship is inherited. This applies with regard to any office amidst the Jewish people. If one acquires it, he acquires it for himself and for his descendants. This came up in modern times. I mean, I'm sure it came up many times, but famously it came up with Yeshiva University. At some point, I don't remember when, in the middle of the 1900s, Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik became the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the seminary at Yeshiva University. When he passed away, there was apparently the beginning of a search committee to find his successor. And several famous rabbinic figures, including Ramosha Feinstein, I think Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and maybe even Rav Aaron Kotler, very famous rabbinic figures, wrote to Yeshiva University and told them that they need to appoint Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik to be the Rosh Yeshiva because he is the son of Moshe Soloveitchik, of Ramosha Soloveitchik, and he is very fitting. He was brilliant and a person who clearly feared God, and they cited this, that this is what you're supposed to do when somebody achieves some kind of position, any office amidst the Jewish people. These office means some kind of leadership position. So this isn't just about kings and high priests. This is something that would apply to any office of leadership if it would appear to even be true for, let's say, rabbis of synagogues, that the preference should be for a son if he's considered worthy. There was a synagogue on the Upper East Side. I don't remember the name of it. Is it Yeshurun or something like that? On the Upper East Side. And I met the rabbi, I have a friend from yeshiva that's now the rabbi of it, but the previous rabbi, whose name has escaped me, he had been the rabbi for 50 years. And before him, his father had been the rabbi for 50 years. So between these two, father and son, they had been rabbis at that synagogue for 100 years. But now it's actually, I haven't seen him in like 40 years, but the guy, his name is Chaim Steinmetz, is now the rabbi of that synagogue. So apparently it was a 2-generation thing, but still. Okay, we will stop here. That was just some stuff we got onto that, again, because we were looking at Negative Commandment 72, and I was talking about what Levites can do, what the Levim can do, and what the Kohanim can do. That Levites are not supposed to do, Levim are not supposed to do the Kohen's job, the Kohen's not supposed to do the Levim's job. And within the various jobs amongst the Levim, one is not supposed to do the other. But it seems like that is only limited to when they're actually assigned to one or the other, because as he made clear, after they're finished with one, they can do, if they've given up one, they can move over to the other one. All right, so we didn't see anything about age there. I know there's a beginning age for Kohanim, and the Torah does talk about it, or we'll see. We'll see if we can zero in on that. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to study with you guys. And our next class will be Monday at this time. So we do it Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays at this time. All right, be well.